Hi, once again, this is Donald, and I'm bringing you my next video review. My first one that I did as a video review was for the book The Next Supper by Corey Mintz. This one is a bit of a change of direction, but before we get into it, if you want to keep receiving these videos, I suggest you should subscribe, hit the like button, and also hit the notification button so you'll find out each time I post a new video. This time around, I'm talking about this book, The Spirituality of Wine, by Gisela H. Kreglinger. She comes from a family of vintners in the Franconia, the area of Germany, that's sort of northern Germany, and her family has been making wine for centuries. And she has written this book, and it's an examination of the way wine is viewed in the Bible and how it's been viewed in the life of the church, and also how vintners, whether they are people who are coming out of or writing or working out of a Christian worldview, or just working out of the secular worldview, how they relate to the life of the vine and all of the things that make it a spiritual activity for them, even if they're not someone who comes from a traditional or well-known faith group. She and her family are Lutheran, so this is from the German Protestant tradition. Now, I figured if I'm going to do a book about wine, I should have some wine. And this is the wine I've chosen. The company's name is Lights, and it's a Riesling. And the reason I've chosen a Riesling is that is what the Kreglinger family produces from their vineyard. This one is not from their vineyard. They're a very small, sort of subsistence kind of vineyard, maybe might be the term, might not be quite accurate, but they do work with Riesling grapes, and so I thought a Riesling would be a good choice to drink along with the book review. So before I start, I'm just going to pour myself a glass. So there's the glass. Now let me just say, starting out, I am not a wine expert. I haven't drunk a lot of wine in my life. I tend to be more of a beer drinker, and probably maybe even more of a Scotch drinker than I am of a wine drinker. But I figured I might as well enjoy a glass of wine, so I might give you a bit of an impression about it, but kind of thing you might want to explore more for yourself. Some things you might be able to rely on my opinions for. Wine isn't particularly one of them. This is a fairly light Riesling. I won't tell you what kind of notes I'm getting because I'm not particularly getting notes. It's a very, it would be enjoyable as a counterpoint to something that may be a little heavier in terms of your food. So if you were having sort of a heavier dessert, this might be a nice complement to it. That's about all I can say about it, but it's quite an enjoyable little sip. So, on to the book. I decided to read this because it was recommended to me by a friend of mine, Dr. Jerry Bowler. He's a retired University of Manitoba history professor and also the world's leading expert on Christmas and Santa Claus. And he saw the book and thought I might be interested. One thing to say about the book is that it's about 10 years old. It's getting on in that age range. Kreglinger herself has written other books as well, including one called The Soul of Wine. So writing about wine and faith and spirituality is definitely an ongoing project of hers. So the first thing I really like about this book is that it takes the physical and the so-called spiritual as both being very important. So things like the labor we do in our occupations, in our vocations, are just as important, but maybe important in a different way, as our praying and as our gathering for Sunday liturgies. So it's very well rooted in the idea that both the body and the spirit are important into our understanding of what it means to enjoy God's grace, God's creation. So it starts, among other things, with a bit of a survey, how wine is referred to in the Bible. And so maybe just a little bit more about the author before I get into that. So she holds, according to the back cover here, a PhD in historical theology from the University of St. Andrews, and she taught Christian spirituality for 4 years before turning to writing full time. So this is an academic work. So lots of footnotes, lots of terminology that you have to keep up with. And fortunately, at the back of this book, there's an awful lot of that as well. There's the glossaries, the notes, page references to different people that are being referred to in the book. So it's a really good book if you want to find out more. If you like, after reading it, going, well, that was interesting. Can I find out more? Yeah, you can. There's lots of notes, bibliography, etc. at the back of the book to help you do that. Now, she points out that her tradition, coming from the Protestant tradition in Europe, Northern Europe in this case, wine has just sort of been part of life. That there was no sort of like, oh, if you go to church, if you're a Christian, you don't drink, you shouldn't drink. There's always been, traditionally and historically, movements within the church that say drinking is bad for you. Alcohol is bad, full stop. But that has not been the majority position in most of the world for most time. And one of the interesting things about this, of course, is that a lot of the wines that are now made by corporate winemakers were first, the vines were first bred and cultivated by monastic communities. And the monasteries played a large role in the development of the wine trade in Europe. And even today, there are some that continue to do that. So that's a worthwhile thing to know. So she goes through and describes all the ways in which, well, maybe not all the ways, but most of the ways in which wine is referred to in the Bible. I think one of the interesting things about this is that she actually focuses on the positives of wine as well as on the negative wines. So one of the first things to say is that she's not saying drink all you want, whenever you want, no matter how much you want, even if it gets you drunk. But she is saying, if you look at the way wine is talked about in the Bible, then you'll find that wine is commended to people on many occasions. Wine is a cause for celebration. Wine is a cause to lift spirits when they are down. There are many wine as a healing agent. So the use of wine for tending wounds. At the same time, there are dangers in how we use wine and how much we drink. one of the things that struck me, was just a little passage, was that kings are not supposed to be given too much drink. Because if you're in power and you're making the rules, when you're overly drinking, you're likely to make bad decisions. Kings are to set an example. And of course, we have examples of kings misusing alcohol. Most notably, David trying to get Uriah drunk so that Uriah will sleep with Bathsheba and can cover up for David's assault, as it basically is, on Bathsheba. So wine usage can be bad. There is a time where wine will be misused. Now, one of the other interesting things I think that I noticed in here, reading this, is in her conversations with the vintners, the people that are growing the grapes and making the wine, and the degree to which all of them feel it is in some way a spiritual activity. Now, it ranges, but there are those who look at it as, yes, this is sort of a living out of my Christian faith, and it's reflected in the way I tend the vines, in the processes I use to make wines, and in the way that I relate to the earth and to the soil and to God's creation through wine. This is, I think, something that we often miss when it comes to something like wine, this idea that we are interacting with God's creation in wine, in the making of wine, in that process of tending the vines. Traditionally, winemaking is a very complicated, mysterious process, but one also that requires a lot of patience. You're not going to get, mostly, a really great wine the first time you try to make it. And she brings this up also in terms of how that reflects on our spirituality, how to the monks, for example, perfecting vineyards, grafting in different branches, trying to find out what kind of yeast makes for a good wine. All of these things were acts of devotion and acts designed to bring a beverage that was a work of worship as much as it was a product to be marketed. And so that's another thing that gets talked about here. Wine making in a traditional sense versus industrial winemaking. Not surprisingly, she comes down on the side of the traditional winemaking. But she doesn't go and talk much to the giant company kind of winemakers. So the large corporate wineries don't get much play in this. But she does talk to a range of smaller sized vineyards where the use of technology to sort of smooth out the flavor of the wine, give you a more consistent wine from year to year. I had a brief email exchange with her brother-in-law, who, along with her sister, runs the family vineyard, and he commented on the possibility, although they, being so small, don't ship wines to North America, wine regions from the Moselle, which is very, very close, almost next door to Franconia, he said, yeah, the Riesling there would give you a good idea. And, 2019 and 2021 are really good years. I didn't end up with a Moselle. I ended up with one from the Rheingau region, and it's a 2020. So it might not be the best of years, but it's still, like I say, it's an enjoyable wine. So it's interesting to read this. There's a lot of history in this book, and I love history, as I may have mentioned in my last video. History is one of my favorite subjects, and so you'll learn the role of the monasteries, particularly in the development of the wine trade in Europe and around the world. Even some of the New World wines in California, particularly, there were monasteries involved in the starting of the vineyards in those areas as well. There's a lot more to this book than that, though. One of the things that she talks about towards the end is this idea of how, as somebody who would be called into pastoral ministry, you would tend for your congregation much in the way that you would tend to vines, that they need attention. You need to help them and encourage them to set down deep roots. That's one of the things about the vines in vineyards and growing grapes, is that they're well suited to sandy, somewhat rocky soil, because it forces them to shoot their roots deep into the earth, and as the roots get shot deeper into the earth, they work harder, and they draw more and new and interesting nutrients out of the soil, therefore giving a greater complexity of taste and enjoyment. So one of the things when she talks about the industrial wines is there's this desire to smooth things out. And while it does, then it also tends to create a sameness in all wines. And one of the things that makes this dangerous is wine trends tend to be set by a very small group of people. And wine trends can change rapidly. And vineyards aren't really designed to be changed every few years. So if you invest in Riesling one year, 5 years later, trying to convert all your vines to Pinot Gris, whatever it is. I know my wines, as you can tell. But if you try and change it to another one, it's several years before that vine will start producing. So winemaking and pastoral work both require patience. Again, as I said at the beginning, she does talk about the dangers of alcohol and wine. It's interesting, one of the things she points out, and I've actually just seen this, I think it was actually on an episode of QI, that the temperance movement didn't really include wine in the things that they were opposed to when they started out. It was really against the cheap gin and beer that were being served. Wine wasn't considered that much of a danger, but as things changed politically, wine sort of got caught up in the movement. Now, beyond that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the theology that goes into this. Wine is used biblically, particularly in imagining the relationship between God and His people, particularly the nation of Israel, back in the Old Testament times. So the wine press, there's the points where the prophets talk about where God had built a vineyard and surrounded it with towers and put a wine press into the middle of it and tended very carefully to the vines. But because the people rebelled, the grapes and the wine that they produced were sour. And of course, that's just one element, and we could dig deeper into all of those elements. And of course, when we think of wine from the Christian perspective, the Eucharist comes to mind. The body and blood of Christ. The wine being the blood, the bread being the body. So, it's a central image in the Christian story. And the use of wine at the Eucharistic table emphasizes that. But there's more to it than just that story. That Jesus' first recorded miracle is going to the wedding at Cana and having the water and turning the water into wine. And not just any wine, but high-end, top-end wine. This is an indication that wine is meant as something for celebration. It's a good part of God's creation. It can be abused, and it certainly is at times. But anything we do can be abused and can be overused. We can become addicted to our jobs. We can become addicted to our hobbies. So wine isn't something that sort of stands alone in that kind of a category. And it's part of God's creation. And when God created the world, God saw that it was good. And we believe that Jesus' redemption of the world is not just a spiritual act for later. The kingdom of this world and of this Christ is now. And we are to live into that promise. We may not be able to live it out fully, but growing and cultivating wine, good wine, not wine simply to anesthetize, not simply to give us, okay, I can buy lots of it and get drunk. And Kreglinger does state, we also shouldn't be too harsh about the way people drink. Because by making wine a little more standardized, it does give the opportunity for people to try it more than once. And so when wines were all over the place in terms of quality and consistency, you were more likely to get a first experience that was awful and say, oh, I don't want that again. And we may not ever be able to get to the point, and we might not want to get to the point where when we look at wine we go, oh yes, I smell, dandelions and fruit and nuts and old gasoline tanks or something, whatever it might be. That's also not the point of enjoying wine as it's created for us. But it is a journey of discovery as you try new and different wines. The fact that they are not just complicated, not just complex, although complexity can be good for us because it forces us to slow down, to stop, and think about what we're doing. But also this idea of we connect a wine with a place. It gives us a little bit of an idea about where this wine came from, the kind of people that lived there, the kind of vineyard owners that work there. And that's where a lot of the newer, oh, this is a big, bold, fruity wine popularizing trends can actually hurt you, because yeah, you're getting a bit of big excitement, but you're missing that which is more subtle and more complex. And again, we do that with each other as people. We miss the things about each other that are not just so much below the surface, but by spending time with each other, by learning each other's likes and dislikes, by finding the things that bring each other joy and entering into that joy, our relationships become deeper, more complex, and richer, more enjoyable. So I think this is a really good book. If you have a chance, pick it up. Again, I recommend that you try and see if you can order it through your local bookstore, because the more the local bookstore survives, the more we as readers and storytellers and story listeners get that sense of place of who we are and where we come from. So I think that's where I'm going to end it today. Please feel free to leave any comments that you might have in the comment section below. And once again, as far as this goes, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and hit the notification button on YouTube. Thanks a lot. Have a good night.